If I want to make a good decision about energy or anything else in life, I need to be committed to looking at both the pros and cons of every alternative. So I need to look at the pros and cons of coal and oil and gas, or any policy, like the pros and cons of Paris, the Paris Climate Accords. But yet what I observed was people don't do this at all in energy. There were certain forms of energy where people only look at negatives, and there are certain forms of energy where people only look at positives. So with fossil fuels and nuclear and usually hydroelectric power, people only look at negatives. And with solar and wind, they only look at positives. And the more I researched, the more I saw this was just blatant. Like, for example, let's take worker safety, which people say they're concerned about. Sometimes you'll have a coal mining accident and people will say, look at all these coal miners who died, look at how dangerous coal mining is. I can't wait until we get to a solar and wind society where everybody is safe. Like, okay, so I look into what are the most dangerous mining practices in energy. And then it turns out, well, they're actually the mining practices to get the materials for solar panels and wind turbines and batteries. But how can somebody say they object to one form of energy because of safety and not object to another form of energy that's even more dangerous? Or take the BP oil spill. You had a lot of really emotional images of birds dying after being drenched in oil. And that people said, well, one reason I'm so upset about this spill is I just love birds so much and it breaks my heart. But then you have wind turbines, and they're essentially engineered to be very efficient at killing birds. It's not their purpose, but it's just part of how they work, and they kill all kinds of birds. And people aren't talking about those. They're like, I hate oil, and one reason I hate them is because of the birds, and yet they don't talk about the birds of something else. So this doesn't prove that fossil fuels are good or that solar is bad or anything like that. All that it proves is that we have a biased discussion. And if you have a biased discussion, you cannot make the right choices. Now, here's the interesting thing for conversation. That bias that's going on, that is part of everyone's context. But beneath all the disagreements that we have about, this amount of warming and renewables replacing whatever, there's a deeper part of the hydra underneath that is the idea in our culture that it's okay to be biased as long as you're against fossil fuels and nuclear and hydro, right? That's an idea that we have in our thinking. People, they just are very loose, just like, well, I don't have to be even-handed as long as I'm attacking fossil fuels. There's no price to pay in our culture for that, right? Like if you over-attack fossil fuels, no big deal. So and part of what is happening, that premise that it's okay to be biased, that operates like a computer program in somebody's thinking. So when they take in information, they're totally okay taking information against fossil fuels and believing it even without questioning it, because they have the idea that it's okay. And they have no problem ignoring any positives. So they have this little computer program running. So it's not just that somebody implanted them with different views than we have, maybe. It's that they have a program that's acting as a filter, like it's filtering out certain things, and then it's adding in certain things. So there's this idea that it's okay to be biased. And that's driving a lot of things in their views, that premise. You can think of it as one good term for this is framework. So, excuse me. Like a framework, in a building you have a framework, which is the starting structure of a building. The key to understand is that every conversation and every thought process also has a framework. It's just that framework is usually invisible. So in most conversations that take place around the world about energy, part of the framework, part of the very foundation is that it is okay to be biased as long as you're against fossil fuels and nuclear and hydro. And it's okay to be biased as long as you're in favor of solar and wind and battery cars. So that might sound even worse, but it's actually better. Because what we have is, we have a variable here in their framework that operates like a program, which means that if you could change that variable, you could change the way they process every incoming piece of information, and certainly that could change how they process what's going on in the conversation. So imagine you could, in the conversation, magically turn off someone's bias switch. How do you think that would make the conversation go? Better or worse?
A lot better.
A lot better. Well, you're about to learn something magic. All you got to do is ask. So I would just say, whatever we're talking about, this is a magic question. Say, would you agree? So let's take Paris. Would you agree that to discover the right policy on Paris, we needed to look at both the pros and cons of staying with it and withdrawing? We can't just look at the pros of staying with it and the cons of withdrawing. So if I said that to someone in San Francisco, what do you think they would say? Sure. So I've asked this kind of question many times, and I have never gotten a no, ever. Nobody has ever not agreed to be less biased in the conversation. But I've almost never met anyone who is unbiased in the conversation if I don't get them to agree. So I can get somebody to agree to be as unbiased as possible, to look at both sides. I can get that to happen if I ask for it, 100% of the time. And almost 100% of the time, they will follow that, as in they will be less biased because of that. And all I had to do was ask that one question. Does that make sense so far? So what we've done is, that's part of the Hydra. We can change the heart of it. We can change the program running everything just by asking. Why? Because people don't actually buy into the program or the framework. There are different reasons to use those different terms. But I'll talk about it as a program for now. People don't know that they're being biased because it's invisible. But once you make the program visible, nobody wants to say, oh, no matter what happens, I'm going to be biased against this one thing versus another. They would like to think that their view against one versus the other came from looking at things in an unbiased way. That's their idea. That's what they would like to think. But it's not the case. They have this subconscious or unconscious bias. So all you have to do to make a big difference is just raise that issue. So that's very powerful, that you can reframe the discussion just by asking them. So let me take another. So one, I mentioned I had 3 objections to the common discussion. It's biased, it's sloppy, it's anti-human. So with bias, the idea is there's this bias driving everything, but people don't really want to be biased. So if you ask them about it, if you ask them, will you look at the pros and cons of both, they will. And the more honest people will catch that they have actually been biased themselves. And whenever you can show somebody in a polite and nice way that their thinking method is wrong or biased, that's a very positive thing that you've done for them. And it will dramatically increase their confidence in you. Also, if you can show that your thinking method is less biased, it'll increase their confidence in you. Any questions about that? Yes? Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, thank you for raising that. Yeah, absolutely. In general, I want to get them to agree to a positive thing, not criticize them for doing a negative thing. I'm glad you raised that. So I want because I want us to be on the same team. If I think about a constructive conversation, what we're really constructing is a shared context. So part of what I need to do to accomplish that is we need a shared framework that we can build on. But if they say something about Paris and I just say, well, don't you realize how biased you're being? That comes across as a personal attack. So if I just say, hey, let's agree to this, and then going forward, they'll start to see, oh, I was biased. So I actually want bias to come out from them, that word. Like, oh, I realize I was being biased. The most I would use it is if I just said, we want to be as unbiased as possible or something like that, but absolutely not accusing the person of something. I want them to agree to the positive. Any other questions? So do any of you think you could use that question in a discussion?
I mean, we're probably biased too.
Well, yeah, so you can even say, you can say if you want that, look, everybody might be coming in with different kinds of incentives. But one benefit of a conversation is that, two of us can be looking for these different pros and cons, and that improves it. So you're not saying, oh, I'm this God-like unbiased creature. You're getting a certain kind of commitment. It's a shared commitment. Of all the things I've figured out in my life, this is up there in terms of one of the most powerful things that one can learn very quickly, is how to frame a conversation. And we're only part of the way through. So let's talk about sloppiness.